The Cadillac's engine ticked in the silence of Route 9, steam rising from under the hood like cigarette smoke in a nightclub. Frank Sinatra sat behind the wheel, his perfectly pressed suit now wrinkled from 3 hours of driving, his famous blue eyes fixed on the neon sign flickering through the Jersey fog. Mel's Diner, open 24 hours. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October 1965. Frank had been driving aimlessly since leaving a recording session in Manhattan, his mind churning with frustration over a song that wouldn't come together the way he heard it in his head. Sometimes the only cure for creative block was the open road and the anonymity of darkness. Through the diner's grease-stained windows, he could see a handful of late-night stragglers, a truck driver hunched over coffee, an elderly couple sharing pie, and behind the counter, a young man in a white apron wiping down glasses with methodical precision. That's when Frank heard it, a voice carrying through the thin walls and across the empty parking lot. Someone was singing "Fly Me to the Moon," his song, his arrangement, his signature piece that had become synonymous with his name. But they were singing it wrong. Frank's jaw tightened. The kid was taking liberties with the melody, adding runs where they didn't belong, stretching syllables that were meant to be crisp, turning his sophisticated swing into something that sounded like... Frank paused, listening closer. What did it sound like? The voice was young, untrained, but there was something in it that made Frank forget about his overheated engine. The kid was singing the song like he meant every word, like he was actually asking someone to fly to the moon with him, not just performing a clever bit of wordplay for a nightclub audience. Frank turned off the radio and rolled down his window. The voice grew clearer. The young man was alone in the diner now. The other customers had left, while Frank wasn't paying attention. He was singing to empty seats and stacked chairs, his voice echoing off vinyl booths and chrome fixtures. "Fly me to the moon, let me play among the stars." But instead of Frank's smooth, controlled delivery, the kid was singing it rough, almost pleading. Like he was actually lonely. Like he actually needed someone to take him away from this roadside diner at 3 a.m. Frank's first instinct was irritation. 20 years in the business, and some nobody kid thinks he can improve on perfection. But as he listened, the irritation began to shift into something else. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition. The young man moved around the empty diner as he sang, stacking chairs, wiping tables, lost in the music. He couldn't have been more than 19, with dark hair that fell across his forehead, and movements that suggested he'd been doing this job for a while, but hadn't given up dreaming about something else. Frank sat in his car for the entire song, watching this kid pour his heart into a performance for an audience of empty coffee cups and flickering fluorescent lights. When the song ended, the silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. Frank looked at the steam still rising from his engine, then back at the diner. He could drive on, find a service station, get back to his life of recording studios and spotlight stages. Or he could walk into that diner and ask this kid what the hell he thought he was doing to his song. The bell above the door chimed as Frank pushed inside. The young man looked up from the coffee machine, and Frank watched his face change as recognition hit. First surprise, then disbelief, then something that looked like fear. "Mr. Sinatra?" The kid's voice was barely a whisper. "I heard you singing," Frank said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. The vinyl was cracked, held together with electrical tape, but it was clean. The young man's face went pale. "I'm sorry. I know it's your song. I wasn't trying to... What's your name, kid?" Tony Benedetto." He was gripping a dish rag like it was a lifeline. "Look, Mr. Sinatra, I was just singing to myself. I didn't think anyone could hear. If I was doing it wrong, You were doing it wrong," Frank interrupted. Tony's shoulders slumped. "But that's not why I'm here." Frank studied the kid's face. There was talent there. He could hear it even in those few nervous words. But more than that, there was something Frank recognized from his own early days. Hunger. Not for food or money, but for something that mattered. Something bigger than wiping down counters at 3 a.m. "You got any coffee that doesn't taste like motor oil?" Tony's hands shook slightly as he poured. "Fresh pot. Made it 20 minutes ago." Frank took a sip. It was actually good coffee. "Tell me about the song." "Sir, my song, the one you were murdering when I walked in. What does it mean to you?" Tony set down the coffee pot carefully. I've been listening to your records since I was 12. My mother has all of them. Fly Me to the Moon is..." He paused, searching for words. It's about wanting to escape, isn't it? About finding someone who makes you feel like you could go anywhere, do anything. Frank raised an eyebrow. Most people heard the song as sophisticated flirtation, nightclub smooth talk. This kid heard it as genuine longing. That why you sing it like that? Like you're actually asking? Tony's cheeks reddened. I guess I don't know how to sing it any other way. Frank was quiet for a long moment, studying this young man who worked the night shift at a roadside diner, but understood his music in a way that surprised him. Sing it again. What? The song, Sing It Again, right now? Mr. Sinatra, I couldn't... Kid. Frank's voice carried the authority of someone who'd been giving orders on stages for 2 decades. Sing. Tony wiped his hands on his apron, cleared his throat, and began. This time, Frank could hear it clearly. The kid wasn't trying to sound like anyone else. He was just singing the song the way he felt it, with a vulnerability that Frank had spent years learning to hide behind technique and swagger. When Tony finished, Frank was quiet for so long that the young man started to fidget. You know what your problem is? Frank finally said. Tony braced himself. You're not singing it wrong. You're singing it honest, and that scares people. Tony blinked. I don't understand. Frank turned on his stool to face him fully. I've been singing that song for 3 years. Every night, I get up on stage and I sell it to rooms full of people who want to hear Frank Sinatra sing Fly Me to the Moon. They want the performance, the style, the confidence. You know what they don't want? Tony shook his head. They don't want to feel like they're actually lonely. They don't want to remember what it's like to really need someone that badly. Frank paused. But you do. You sing it like you mean it, like you'd actually get on that rocket if someone asked you to. Is that bad? Frank considered this. In his world, vulnerability was something you controlled, something you revealed in careful doses for maximum impact. But listening to this kid sing, he remembered something he'd almost forgotten. The difference between performing emotion and feeling it. What time you get off work? 6 a.m. But Mr. Sinatra, I don't understand why. You ever been to a recording studio, Tony? The question hung in the air between them, like cigarette smoke. Tony stared at Frank, as if he'd asked whether he'd ever been to the moon. No, sir. Frank pulled out his wallet, left a $5 bill on the counter for coffee that cost 30 cents. Be at Capitol Records Thursday morning, 10 a.m., ask for Studio B. He was halfway to the door when Tony found his voice. Mr. Sinatra? Wait, why are you doing this? Frank paused, his hand on the door handle. Through the glass, he could see his Cadillac waiting in the parking lot, steam no longer rising from the engine. He thought about the recording session he'd left earlier, the song that wouldn't come together because he'd been singing it the same way for so long he'd forgotten what it meant. Because 20 years ago, someone gave me a chance to sing a song my way instead of the way everyone else thought it should be sung. Frank looked back at Tony. And because sometimes we need to remember that the point isn't to get it right, the point is to mean it. Thursday morning, Tony Benedetto walked into Capitol Records wearing his only good shirt and carrying his mother's blessing. Frank was already there, along with Nelson Riddle and a full orchestra. They spent 6 hours working on Fly Me to the Moon, not trying to recreate Frank's version, but finding something new in the space between confidence and vulnerability. The recording they made that day was never released, but it changed everything for both of them. Frank learned to listen to songs differently, to find the emotion underneath the technique. Tony learned that his honesty wasn't something to hide, but something to build on. Within 2 years, Tony Benedetto had become Tony Bennett, and the style he'd discovered in Mel's Diner at 3 a.m. became his signature. Emotional truth delivered with technical excellence. Frank kept that first recording in his personal collection for the rest of his life. Sometimes, when the industry felt too polished, too calculated, too far from the music that had made him fall in love with singing in the first place, he'd play it back and remember a kid in a diner who sang like he meant every word. The lesson wasn't about perfection, it was about connection. It wasn't about getting it right, it was about making it matter. That night, the song didn't belong to Frank Sinatra or Tony Bennett. It belonged to anyone who'd ever looked up at the moon and wished they were somewhere else with someone who understood them. Sometimes the most important moments in music history happen in places where no one's recording, where no one's watching, where there's nothing at stake except the truth of what you're feeling when you open your mouth to sing. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, someone who knows the difference between performing and meaning, it happens to be listening.